перейти на английский язык, потому что меня просили преподавать на английском языке. So let's switch to English. Maybe you can tell me just a little bit about who you are. Are you mostly MA students or BA students? What is your background? Who are you MA students? Raise your hands. Okay. Okay. In political science or some other departments. The only reason why I'm asking this question is because I want to know where I will need to stop, elaborate. In any case, my request for you is to feel absolutely free to stop me at any point, to ask questions. I'm not making any assumptions. I'm used to teaching students with different level, with different background. So whatever questions you might have, you will stop me even in the middle of the lecture. Okay? I do have some slides for you, but mostly they are to assist you in processing some of this material. I'm happy to deviate. I'm happy to discuss some other issues related to these slides, but not exactly on these slides. So the format should be flexible. I want to keep it flexible so we can have a conversation. Ideally, you would have some questions, I would have some answers, and perhaps vice versa. And that's what we can call interactive lecture, rather than simply giving you summary points. So let's see how it goes. I was asked to give 2 lectures related to theory of international relations, which is one of my specialties. And so these 2 lectures are primarily in the area that I and my father jointly sometimes published. And this is also a prelude to yet another project that we are entertaining, also about IR, theory of international relations, specifically in Russia. That's why the first lecture is on Russian IR, the second one is American IR, and how the 2 are similar or different. Some of these points are debatable, and I want to be you understand the different sides of this debate. What I will present to you is a part of new international relations theory debate. Those of you who have IR theory background, you might recall that there are multiple debates in international relations, from idealism versus realism to scientific approaches versus traditionalism. Then there is yet another development in IR theory that has to do with culture versus rationalist approaches. Sometimes it's called reflectivism versus rationalism, or the so-called war of paradigms. So this debate is new because it extends our knowledge about international relations theory beyond the Western core. Because this is where international relations theory is from. These are the roots of international relations theory as we know it. Sometimes these roots are identified as medieval Western philosophy, but mostly they have been introduced to you as the very early 20th century developments. Hans Morgenthau, A.H. Carr, these names should be familiar to you. And if that's the case, then typically international relations theory is a Western theory, right? And so one position in this new debate is that international relations theory is by definition Western and global at the same time. It can only be global if it is rooted in the West. And Western assumptions, Western theories, Western ideas, Western concepts become global concepts. And they begin to travel across the world, and ultimately they are to validate what is happening across the world, in Africa, in Europe, and incidentally in Russia as well. So that's one position in this debate, that IR is Western and global at the same time. And it's well reflected, this position, not only in the West, but in Russia as well. You can find positions similar to this one in some IR institutions in Moscow and elsewhere. That's one view. On the other side of this, if you think about theories as I do in terms of political spectrum, then on the other side of the spectrum is the nationalist IR, nationalist position, that anything we do only applies to us. There is nothing universal. Whatever the West does is not applicable to us. Not only it is not applicable to us, but it is harmful. Because the West, through its culture, through its assumptions, through its theories and approaches, colonizes us. And therefore, true IR theory for Russia can only be nationalist IR theory. And the more we isolate it from the Western universe, from the Western hemisphere, from the Western IR, the better it is for our indigenous development. So that position is also present, not so much in international relations institutions, but it's there, it's present. Think Alexander Dugin, for example. Think some versions of Eurasianism. Not all Eurasianism. Eurasianism is quite complex, as I will try to show you in a moment. But certainly some versions of this exist. And that potentially is a more isolationist tradition. That's the other position in this debate. The true IR can only be anti-Western. Non-Western is anti-Western. Globalization is harmful. Globalization is by definition Western. What I will present to you is something else, is something different. Something that will maybe call the third position. I will argue that yes, international relations theory reflects certain national assumptions. It's a product of culture, it's a product of certain ideas, certain values, and certain ideologies. But that does not mean that global does not exist. That does not mean that global IR is not something that we should strive for. Wherever we are, in Russia, in Africa, in Egypt, in Latin America, we should try to have a global conversation. And global is, therefore, a constellation, combination of locals, different local traditions. And these traditions do not have to be expressed in nationalist language. You simply have to be aware of who you are. You have to be aware of the fact that some American theories will work here, but only to a limited extent. Because this is a different culture, this is a different environment, this is a different geography, different political concepts and ideas, and that's okay, that's normal, because we're all different. So global, in this case, is viewed as a product of a dialogue, as a product of cross-cultural conversation, as a product of diversity, if you will. And that's the position that I will try to argue from with you today, present to you today. So, let me move on. These are some of the questions that I want to discuss with you. First, let's talk about how theory gets formed. International relations theory is a complex enterprise, and there are different theories of how IR knowledge is formed. I will take specifically a sociological approach, sociology of knowledge approach that has roots in, to some extent, Max Weber, to some extent, another German philosopher, Mannheim, and yet another German philosopher, I'm sure you're familiar with, is Karl Marx, the early work of whom is viewed, typically associated with sociology of knowledge, because he argued the position of ideology as a primary driver of knowledge as well. Then let's talk a little bit about Western IR problematique. What is it? What are some of the most important ideas, some of the most important concepts that the West is interested in? And as you will see, Russia today, in Russian IR, is very much interested in similar concepts and similar ideas. And that too, IR position, because there is a potential for cross-fertilization, for a dialogue between Western and various non-Western approaches. And Russia, in fact, has roots in both camps, in the West and non-West. It's more complex than that. So let's talk about Western IR problematic, and then move on to Russian IR theory, trying to understand conditions for its formation, different schools of thought, different traditions within Russian IR. Some of it you will see actually is quite similar with the way Western IR is structured. Then some of the contemporary developments, and what I will describe to you as a crisis of Russian IR, contemporary crisis of Russian IR, and what can be done, what needs to be done, in my assessment anyway, for moving forward in Russian IR. As I said, feel free to stop me at any point, otherwise I'll keep going, because that's what professors are. Professors just love talking, so just stop me at any point. Otherwise, I'll keep going. So these are some of the names for you, some of the ideas of sociology of science approach. And just so we know, there is also a materialist concept of knowledge formation. There are scholars such as Randall Collins and others who believe that knowledge in principle is a product of material developments. If you have certain level of economic development, you can afford more liberal Western IR. If you don't, then you are stuck with different approaches, realist, dependency-oriented approaches. Some of you know the name E.H. Carr, I trust. So E.H. Carr had an idea that there are only two theories in international relations. One of these theories is a theory of exploitation from the position of strength. And that's what Western IR is. It's about simply finding ways of taking advantage of the rest of the world, either through ideology, either through so-called promotion of democracy, either through market economy approaches, what have you. And the other theory is a theory of less developed nations, poor nations. And the only way these theories can be developed will be the theories of dependency, theories of liberating themselves from this exploitation, exploitative concept imposed by Western world. This is one more materialistic concept of IR knowledge formation. My concept is more complex, it incorporates some of the material developments as well, and it is rooted in several important names. As I mentioned to you, Karl Marx, specifically early Marxian work called German Ideology. Mannheim, who was arguing that ideology is essential for development of social theory. Any theory has certain ideological assumptions. Even those theories that claim that they are universal, that claim that they are scientific, that claim that they are rationalistic and rational, and universally applicable, are still products of certain ideological and cultural assumptions. That too is rooted in Mannheim, is rooted in Max Weber, who was also arguing that culture is behind social science. And this is an ongoing tradition. I simply have a couple of more names for you here. One is Stephen Toulmin, who wrote a provocative book called The Hidden Agenda of Modernity. And it's about rationalism, it's about enlightenment as an exploitation project. And more recently, of course, this is a debate that has to do with constructivism. Those of you who are in IR and have an IR background, you will recall this debate between constructivism on the one hand and rationalism on the other. For rationalists, what is the key concept for rationalism? What's the difference between rationalism and constructivism? Maybe you can tell me one simple difference.
A unique way.
Say again?
A unique way in international relationship.
Identity, did you mention?
Yes, I mean identity.
Okay. Okay, so identity is a part of what? Rationalist or constructivist vocabulary? It's constructivism, right? So in constructivism, identity is more important than interest, right? Rationalists simply assume that we all know what our interests are. Right? You guys know that your interest is, for instance, to finish this program, to graduate, and then look for employment that you will like. Constructivists will say that yes, interests are important, but before you ask questions about interests, you must first know who you are. So first you ask questions about your own identity. Before you come here to study, you need to know who you are. You need to know that you potentially see yourself as an educated professional, as a scholar, as someone who will take advantage of this knowledge. So constructivism stresses subjectivity, stresses identity, stresses ideas, social norms, and that too is a product of or related to sociology of science. One other point related to this is that so-called universal idea of universal is oftentimes extremely difficult, if not impossible to achieve. And generally speaking, knowledge that is general is harder to produce. Think about how different we all are. Think about how different, let's say, French education, from German education, from Chinese education, from Russian education, from American education. Is it really possible to produce theories, let's say by French scholars or by American scholars, that will then explain what is happening very far away from France and from Britain and from the United States, somewhere in Africa or in Russia? Or perhaps this is too brave and too much to expect. That's what social theory, sociology of science explains. It explains that this kind of a generalizability, production of very general knowledge, is not possible. That does not mean that we should not try to explain what is happening in remote areas outside Russia, outside the United States, if you are in the United States, but we have to be aware of all the problems. And the problems are that, again, these are very different sets of cultural ideational approaches and assumptions. And some of you may have heard about the idea of paradigms, the idea that was introduced by Thomas Kuhn. Have you ever heard the name Thomas Kuhn? Raise your hands, those who have. Well, quite a few have. So Thomas Kuhn is someone who introduced the notion of paradigm, right? And he argued specifically that paradigm is what makes it impossible to produce general knowledge. Whatever we produce, but he was not even a social scientist. In social scientists it's even harder. But he was trying to understand the developments in natural sciences, in physics, in mathematics, in other natural sciences. And even there he was arguing, knowledge that we produce and we deem to be absolute, universal, then all of a sudden changes and entirely different theories are produced. And he called these circumstances paradigm. So it's even more applicable to social sciences. So on that basis, you can reach a very pessimistic conclusion, and some of my students have, but actually it's not even worth trying. IR theory is a doomed enterprise. We all produce our own theories. These theories are locked in their own cultural, psychological, political assumptions. And that means we simply cannot have a global IR. But I think that would be too pessimistic approach to take, because as you will see, multiple cultural approaches have something to agree on. they have sometimes similar problematic, and so that dialogue is a necessity ultimately for living peacefully. Because if you cannot understand who the other is, what his or her cultural ideas are, then ultimately you may be tempted to impose your own cultural ideas. And then you'll be surprised that generates rejection, confrontation, hostility, and before you know it, we are fighting each other. So that kind of cross-cultural dialogue is a necessity for moving forward. Any IR theory, therefore, has more than one function. One you and I have just mentioned. It's about producing some general theories. It's about producing theories that will apply beyond one case. That's what social science is, right? That's the scientific component. Science is about producing some generalizations, either hypotheses or theories that must be tested, testable propositions. If X is present, then Y must fall, right? What should I give you as an example? Theory. Well, here is one very familiar Western theory. All democracies don't fight each other. Have you heard of it? I'm sure you have. Right? So if democracy is present, then peace must follow. At least in the relationships within democracies. That's a theoretical function of IR. Any international relations, as difficult as it might be, should strive to produce some general knowledge. Knowledge that would be ideally applicable not just in one case, but in multiple cases. In the United States, this reached the degree of enormous proportion. Many IR departments are interested in testing theories, testing propositions. They are giving students multiple courses in statistical analysis, in game theory. Students sometimes know mathematics better than they know political science and sociology. Because they believe in science, they believe in scientific progress, they believe in producing universal knowledge and ultimately changing the world with that knowledge. Well, as I said, that is brave, but sometimes not well supported by factual developments. Democracies don't fight each other right now is not taken very seriously outside the United States. So the second function of any theory is cultural. If in the first case it's about searching truth beyond culture, beyond geography, beyond politics, then in the second case it's about culture. It's about acknowledging and admitting that science is not only about testing hypotheses and producing some facts, but it's also about culture. It's about certain values, it's about certain ideas, and everywhere science is different. It's a product of society. It's a reflection of values, it's a reflection of traditions. And whoever we are, Americans, Russians, we will bring with us certain characteristics of our culture, history, and tradition. And last but not least, it's about future as well. It's about image of the future. And this applies to social science much more than it applies to mathematics, physics, and natural sciences. Because oftentimes social science is about predicting what will happen, or projecting a certain idea of the future, as we say, the image of a desired future. Образ желаемого завтра, as it is commonly said in Russian. So any IR theory has образ желаемого завтра, has certain idea of what the future will look like. And that too is not very scientific. It has to do with culture, it has to do with political preferences,
And even though some scientifically mindful scholars will tell you that no, we're not about future, we're not about projecting, we're not about ideology, we're not about culture, we are about science, you can still decipher certain ideas of the future that these theories project, such as democracies don't fight each other. The future, the optimal future for this theory is that the whole world must become democratic, right? And it must become democratic the way we define democracy. It must be liberal type of democracy. Otherwise, there will be wars and confrontation. So all theories have very interesting language and very interesting implications. You simply must read through these theories and identify these implications to understand where they are coming from. Here is one model that I favor specifically associated with the American political scientist and sociologist who actually passed away several years ago. His name is Stanley Hoffman. His model of IR theory development, and he meant specifically American IR, but as you will see, it applies to other national IRs, to Russian IR as well. He meant American IR and how that IR was introduced in the first place, how it developed, and he paid attention to three levels specifically: ideas, power, ambitions of political elites, and institutions. Let me say a few words about each of those. I'll tell you a little bit more about each of those when we talk about American IR, but if you have in mind the United States, then what he has in mind specifically here is American ideology of exceptionalism. American ideology of exceptionalism and universalism. As you remember, founding fathers in the United States had the image that the United States is potentially above the world. The rest of the world will eventually learn what the United States has become. It's a shining city on the hill, as they said. And that's why sometimes you hear from American politicians that the rest of the world is simply a little bit behind. It will eventually become what we are already. My favorite part here is how George W. Bush was once asked about Iraq and the Middle East. He said, well, yes, right now they're very different. Some say these people are fundamentally different, culturally different, but I think they're actually like us. Fundamentally, there is an American hiding inside either one of them. It's just a matter of time before they will come out and become American. So that idea is very important, the idea of exceptionalism and universalism. Some call it supremacy, ideological rather than racial supremacy. America is not about race, it's about idea, first and foremost, is what drove American IR to establishment as well. Then, of course, it also has to do with power, with ambitions of, in this case, American elites. And I'll come back to this point in a moment, because American elites up until today are firmly convinced that the world will be unipolar, that the world will continue to be centered on American material and material power capabilities and on American ideas. Yes, China is catching up with us economically, but they will never catch up with us otherwise, because there is a technology gap and because we are armed with superior ideas, with superior technology, we have superior institutions, and ultimately the world will be revolving around the United States. In this case, it's not just an idea, it's ambitions, it's status aspirations. And institutions, in this case, what's meant by institutions is how closely international relations theories are connected to policy establishment, whether or not they produce theories that will be useful for policy making. I already mentioned the democracies don't fight each other. Well, actually, this was used quite closely by Bill Clinton and several other American politicians as a justification of their foreign policy. And the other side of it, the other dimension of institutional importance is simply money. If you have enormous resources that American institutions have for development of IR, then you will be able ultimately to promote American ideas, American theories more successfully than those nations that do not have the same resources. I'll come back to this, but Americans during the Cold War promoted their ideas by giving out textbooks of American IR theory free for the rest of the world. They shipped in volumes multiple textbooks. Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation were involved in this. And they had a very important domestically available financial resources for development of IR. That's how Hoffman explained how American IR developed since the 20th century. Let me, before I apply it to Russia, let me say just a few words about the problematic, Western IR problematic. Probably can be presented on two levels. One is that it's about the world system, the international system. Those of you who studied Russian political theory, they will recall that historically Russians did not use the concept of system. That does not mean that Russians didn't care about the world. In many ways, Russian political theory is all about the world. It's all about Russia's relationships with Europe and non-Europe. But the idea of system is really Western idea. And it's all about, when it comes to mainstream Western IR, it's all about origins of the international system. It's about causes of the rise and fall, multipolar, bipolar, unipolar systems, and how these systems change, what does it take to change the system, what are the rules, what is the structure, and structure is primarily about polarity and poles, what is the balance of power, is it reached or is it not reached. That's one level of IR problematic. And this one is not unique, as you can see, with some exceptions. This is really what many Russian scholars are trying to understand as well. And many Chinese scholars are trying to understand as well. For those of you guys who are taking pictures, I'm more than happy to send it to you if you ask me. And then the second level has to do with foreign policy. It's less present in IR theory, because there is a second level called foreign policy theories. But in this case, it's also about values, interests. And the other part of problematic is methodology, is again how you produce knowledge. Do you strive for universal knowledge? Western knowledge is very much about universal knowledge. Do you try to produce knowledge that will ultimately help you understand international implications of power, global rules, values, and it's about national perception as well. So that's the problematic. It's, you might see that there are multiple similarities with what Russian scholars study as well, including those who are studying here with you, who are your professors are. But then again, why is it that we reach so different conclusions? Russia and the West are studying the same. They're interested in the international system. They're interested in foreign policy. They're trying to understand norms and world order. And yet, when it comes to specific issues, there are fundamental disagreements. Right? Here is one example for you. One issue that divides us all, right, when it comes to Russia and the West. The conflict in Ukraine. Why is it that we have radically different perspectives on this conflict in Ukraine? You ask what Russians think of it and what Americans think of it, there is no greater difference in perspectives. For the United States, the world is essentially centered on American ideas, because these ideas are universal, let's not forget. Right? The world is unipolar. When the Cold War was over, the United States brought in a more progressive world order, a system in which there is no sphere of influence. This is an old concept. It was established by Yalta, by Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, devising this on a napkin. It's a much more progressive system. It's a system that is based on democracy, and ultimately nations will be better off by adopting liberal standards, by trading with each other, by building institutions that the United States is here to support. Right? So that conflict, from American perspective, is one example of a major revisionism, an attempt on part of Russia to undermine that fair, just, and secure international order. Vladimir Putin brutally interfered in this conflict. He annexed Crimea and supported separatists. He therefore undermined the international law, the existing international rules and principles. And therefore, we must do everything in our power to restore that progressive post-World War order. Right? That's a very common mainstream interpretation of what happened in Ukraine from American theoretical perspective. Now, I must say that not all Americans think that way, but the mainstream theories certainly assume that what Russia is going for is a violation of generally acceptable norms and principles in the international system. From Russian perspective, it's entirely different reality. It's entirely different case. From Russian perspective, the United States is a revisionist power, not Russia. Because after World War II, world order was established based in Yalta, based on principles of Yalta, and based on institutions that were devised around the United Nations principle. When the United States came after the end of the Cold War, it all of a sudden decided that it would be able to decide and dictate the new rules for the world. And key decisions, foreign policy decisions, will not be based on the United Nations. It will be based on what Americans think is best for the world. And our legitimate interests, you can call it sphere of influence if you want, that's your business. But the fact of the matter is, all major powers, including Russia, have interests outside Russia as well. And if you don't respect these interests, if you support illegal change of power in Ukraine and Kyiv, then we will bound to interfere. And we will interfere based on principles laid out in the Yalta international system, in the Yalta world order system. It's a very different proposition. It's a very different interpretation of events. It's a clash of values. In this case, values that are inherently forming and shaping and reflecting radically different international relations theories. Right? That's one example for you. Well, that's a summary. Western view, Russia is a revisionist power, and the West therefore needs to contain Russia. And from Russian perspective, it's just the opposite. And not only that, but we are moving in the different direction of new world order, and Russia is now doing the world a favor by trying to undermine the world order that is principally unjust. Now let me apply these conditions to Russia. I laid out these three conditions for you as formulated by Stanley Hoffman: ideas, power aspirations, and institutions. Russian idea is very different from American idea. It's the idea that is rooted in the 16th century mentality, the masculine mentality, is the idea of a relatively limited, geographically limited, but still considerably large geographic sphere of influence that had to do with Russian values that at the time were defined as Christian values of Orthodox Christianity. Soon after, you remember this story probably as well as I do, soon after Turks defeated Byzantium, Russia was left alone as a center of Orthodox Christianity, and the Russian Orthodox monk named Philofey formulated the maxim that Russia is the third Rome, and the fourth is not to be, right? Россия третий Рим. Right. That's the idea, the initial idea, and it transmutated, it changed on multiple occasions, with the exception of a relatively short period of time, which is communism, 70 years of global expansionism in terms of leftist socialist ideas. Russia historically over centuries had relatively limited foreign policy application, limited to this area of Eurasia, Balkans, and Ottoman Empire populated by Orthodox Christians. The Balkans in this case is also something that has roots in the Ottoman Empire and Russian aspirations to build relationships with Turks based on respecting Russian Orthodox Christians. Because that's how honor, Russian honor, was defined at the time. It was not a global idea, not comparable to what American idea of being above the world, shining city of the field. Russia certainly has its own mission, and certainly that idea was reflected in Russia as the third Rome. But beyond this hemisphere, Russians did not want, for example, that some people in Africa or in Asia and Latin America would convert into Orthodox Christianity. It's a more local idea. And over time, Russia also developed very close relationships with Europe. Sometimes these relationships are antagonistic, as it is today, for example. Sometimes these relationships are estrangement, but often, very often, and historically this is the case, these are very close diplomatic, political, economic, and cultural exchanges between Russia and Europe. That's the way it was, and that's the way it will be, no matter how complex these relationships are today. Simply because Russia historically, culturally is part of Europe, and I might say that vice versa. Europe is part of Russia as well. So that's a very different idea, and that's something that is then reflected in Russian IR theories, as I will give you a couple of examples as we continue. The second level is elites and power ambitions. What's important here is the notion of great power. Most Russians, if not all, believe that Russia cannot exist if it's not a great power. Once it's getting weaker as a power, it develops all kinds of separatist problems. It develops all kinds of problems with neighbors, partly because it is a tough neighborhood in the first place. Unlike the United States, Russia is in Eurasia, it's in the presence and surrounded by major countries, major powers, and it always historically had issues with neighbors. It fought multiple wars with Turks, it fought multiple wars with European neighbors. So that is Russia's great power ambitions in this case. And you see it everywhere in political statements as well. Right? If you go back to Putin's statements, it's there as well. We must be a great power, otherwise we will not exist. So that's well reflected in Russian idea as well. In Eurasia, it translates into the idea that we must have either veto power over some very important developments. Think about NATO expansion. If NATO is likely to expand, will want to expand, that it must be done only when we are members of that organization. Otherwise, we will veto this process because it challenges our national security, because it undermines our perception of security in the region. And so we must have veto in Eurasian affairs to the extent possible. And in global affairs, we will not be able, of course, to control everything. We are not Americans after all. But we will be able to have an important say in international affairs, right? After all, we are members of very important organizations. We are sitting in the United Nations Security Council. So we will not dictate to the rest of the world what to do. But we will nevertheless have a very important voice in these affairs. And then think back what Hoffman meant by institutions. It's about resources, financial resources, and it's about how close you are to power, to policymakers. In Russia, somehow, I find, and correct me if you think differently, I'm happy to have this discussion, the stress is on geopolitics. Russians are obsessed with geopolitics. They think that geopolitics is really the only thing that is going on in the world. So you have think tanks, you have funds allocated for geopolitical studies, you have geopolitical foundations, you have geopoliticians, beginning with Alexander Dugin again. Geopolitics is the name of the game. And this is something that also is connected to foreign policy, is connected to the state. And if you're able to find money, mostly for studying geopolitics. And you have all kinds of geopolitical conspiracy theories. If you're looking for a project in international relations, here, take it as an idea. Conspiracy theories is a new thing. Geopolitics is one source of it. So this is how it works in case of sociology of science application, in case of Russia. Let me talk a little bit about traditions. How much time do we have? Again, this is something that is based on published research. So if you want elaboration of this, ask me and I'll tell you where to find the publications. But normally, traditions combine both local and global trends and developments. Right now, the discussion in IR, as I said, this is a new debate, is to what extent non-Western IR traditions shape knowledge. Some say that global is more important than local. Some say that local is more important than local. And others are somewhere in between. If you think about China and Chinese international relations theory, Chinese, incidentally, are very active today. Much more active than Russians and many other non-Western theories in developing their own IR theory, promoting their own theory, and developing their own. But historically, Chinese are quite local in their outlook. Right? Think about their idea. If American idea is a shining city on the hill, and Russian idea is the third Rome, then Chinese idea is the Middle Kingdom. Right? It's a local tsardom, if you will, that controls developments in its own hemisphere, mostly through political and economic relations. And to some extent, that continues to develop and lives on today. In Russia, you will find multiple traditions. I find at least 3 traditions present with roots. Most of these traditions have roots in the 15th, 16th century. And they live on, they continue, they rise and fall and continue to survive again. One tradition is Westernism. The stress here is, there is a summary for you. That Russia in this case is part of the West. The other in this case are those who are not part of the West, non-Western world, and therefore the course of action for Russia, the grand strategy, if you will, is to simply try to integrate with the West, right? Because the West is most progressive civilization. The West is universal. The West is above the rest of the world. And lucky for us, we have been part of the West, at least since the Vienna Concept that was established after defeating Napoleon. So that's what we should continue to be doing. That's a very rich tradition in Russia. We have multiple versions of it, more liberal, more socialist, more statist, but it's a powerful tradition, and it continues to be powerful today. If you think about different think tanks, you'll find the voices of this tradition, let's say in Российский совет по международным делам, as opposed to Совет по внешней оборонной политике, which is a different tradition. Although that's not quite theory, it's more about think tanks and expert community, but the idea is there. The second tradition is tradition what I call держава, or statism. In this case, most important value for Russia is to be a great power, to preserve sovereignty in international affairs. Westernizing stress economic reforms, political reforms, modernization, and westernization. To them, modernization and westernization are the same. Something that, by the way, Chinese would take issues with, right? Because they are modernizing, but not necessarily westernizing. But for statism, key values have to do with order, with stability, with sovereignty, and preservation of great power. Right? So you have here others potentially threaten Russia's sovereignty and independence. And therefore, the way to survive, the way to prosper in foreign policy, grand strategy, should be simply to build great power status. To become a normal great power means to be accepted by other great powers. Ultimately, isn't that what Vladimir Putin is all about? And of course, we have our own civilizational tradition, right? Also very powerful, well presented. Again, if you think about theory in terms of political spectrum, left and right, then you have both left and right versions of cultural distinctiveness, civilizational distinctiveness. Eurasianists, Slavophiles would be more on the right, because they would stress traditional values, they would stress geopolitics, they would stress certainly Slavophiles, Christianity, and Russian Orthodox Christianity, and that's the connection to Europe, because Europe too is Christian, even though it's not Orthodox. And then you have left version, which is Russian communism. Now you might say, well, communism is a Western idea. Sure, it is. But Russian communism is a different communism than communism of Karl Marx. It has obtained very different qualities, very different ideologies, very different characteristics. It became national communism rather than global idea of turning the whole world into communism. Trotsky is one story, but Joseph Stalin and others is entirely different story. So you have distinctiveness of left nature, so to speak. And what I would argue, what I would submit to you is that Russian IR theory, if it is to develop, must somehow respond to all these traditions, must engage with all these developments, because that's what Russia is. It's a big country. Это большая страна. You'll find everything here. And you cannot suppress something at the expense of something. You must have a cross-cultural, cross-traditional dialogue, not only on the outside, but inside as well. You cannot have Russian civilizationism at the expense of Russia's old relations with Europe. You will not fly very far. let me give you just a couple of illustrations here. And these are some examples of how these assumptions stop. Okay. To show some concepts in Russian IR, how these reflect traditions. To show to you that these traditions are there, they are alive and well, and they inform theory building. And concepts is one representation of theory. Concepts, theory in general is either concepts or propositions. So these concepts are in front of you. Specifically about the international system, regional order, and foreign policy objective. Westernizers produce concepts, even though they don't see themselves sometimes as westernizers, they produce concepts that fit Western assumptions about the world. Some of them argue that Eurasia is not something that will survive, will persist. Regionalism will not be a potent force in world politics, that the world is becoming increasingly West-centered, and therefore Russian foreign policy objective is ultimately to integrate with Western institutions. This was well developed in the 90s, this continues to be somewhat present in Russian foreign policy discussions today. Statist language is different. It's language of polarity. It's language, some of you might recall Evgeny Primakov's thinking that the new multipolar world is on horizon, and therefore Russia will be one of these poles. The idea of multipolarity is what the international system is, and regional order, Eurasia for Russia, is essential, and Russia therefore is not just a regular state. It's a post-imperial state, a state that is ultimately responsible for providing order and stability in Eurasia. It's not about empire, it's not about building or rebuilding the Soviet empire. It's about making sure that this world regional order doesn't collapse. And ultimately, foreign policy must be not pro-Western, but multi-vector foreign policy. Some of it must be directed towards the West, naturally, specifically towards Europe, but a lot of it must be developed to Asia. Primakov was in many ways prophetic about Russia's turn to Asia in the 90s. And civilizational school also informs concepts that have been produced by some Russian scholars, such as wars of civilization, Eurasian Empire, Orthodox Empire. Some of you might recall not just Dugin, whom I mentioned, but also Alexander Panarin as an Orthodox philosopher, someone who produced the idea of Orthodox Empire. And here, foreign policy objective, first and foremost, is to preserve self-sufficiency. You cannot depend on others. If you want to survive and prosper, you must have your own sources of economic and political development. And that's one version of civilizational thinking. The other one has roots in dialogue. It stresses pluralism of civilizations rather than potential conflict. It identifies Russia as a country that has relationships with East and West at the same time. It's Euro-Eastern civilization, that's something that Gleb Pavlovsky introduced. It's Euro-Pacific civilization, actually not civilization, but Euro-Pacific country, something that Dmitry Trenin and others introduced. It's Euro-Asian, of course, it's an older concept. And the idea here is to engage in cultural dialogue that will be potentially fruitful. Why am I talking about potential crisis? Well, it's based on research. 5 years ago, my father and I did a survey among IR theorists in Russia, those who teach international relations theory across Russia. And some data that we come up with as a result of this, I want to share with you, indicate the crisis. It's not just because Russia is not yet visible in global debates. Aksakov used to say that it's important for us to develop Russian worldview. Well, I don't know if we can actually conscientiously, purposefully develop the Russian worldview, but we are potentially culturally distinct. And many people who teach Russian IR theory, many people who understand how it works, sense potential issues with Russia's international relations development. But here, we simply ask the question, how would you describe Russian IR theory development today relative to the 90s? Again, this survey was taken 5 years ago. 50%, half of those, when we ask, describe the state of the relationships, Russian IR theory development as a crisis. 23, as you see, is that this is potentially overcoming crisis already, we're making progress, and 10%, only 10%, as generally successful development. And then the second dimension of the same question is, how is Russian IR doing relative to foreign theories, however you wish to define foreign, Western or non-Western. Here, 50%, same 50%, half of those who asked this question said that this is not sufficient. Our developments are not sufficient to match our needs to be present in global discussions. And 37%, somewhat interesting as well, describes IR theory in Russia as increasingly dependent on Western approaches. So at least subconsciously, there is a desire to have more independence in Russian IR theory. Again, this is where it comes from, the notion of crisis. And you might ask yourself, well, if that's the case, if it's accurate to describe Russian IR theory development as crisis, then what are the causes of it? What are the reasons? We ask this question too. This is the answer. And actually, the most important reason is that nobody needs us. Okay, it's not that we don't have money. It's not about insufficient financial resources. This one is only 18%. And it's not just about weaknesses of our professional education. Certainly we have some weaknesses. Certainly we have ways sometimes to catch up with more advanced programs in the world. But most importantly, 70%, it's about perception of self-perception by Russian IR scholars, by Russian IR theories, is that there is no demand for what they do. Нет запроса. Nobody needs a theory. That's why there is no theory, simply put. Right? That's the answer. And again, this can be explained on multiple levels. Some say, well, this is still young discipline, Russian IR, after the end of the Soviet Union. Some say we have little relative to the United States, little financial resources. But this is not the key explanation. The key explanation, again, is that we have lack of need on part of the state. IR theory, as any social science, is inherently political, right? Either you are developing something that potentially help your country politically and help the world politically. Either you are supporting and endorsing, or you are criticizing because you are not happy with the way things are. But in both cases, you are inherently political, and that's why this perception that we need to have political resources, we need to have political approval, is so important. Our foreign policy, and that's also self-perception, is often foreign policy that is not based on some scientific research. It's not based on some sophisticated IR theories. It's mostly improvisations. It's mostly reactions to what's done by some important Western or non-Western partners. And so that's one of the issues. Lack of resources is only part of it. And recently we have developed more and more awareness of Russia being part of non-Western world. So that too needs to be reflected, needs to be somehow supported by theorizing, and it's not at this point. What are the prospects on that basis? Well, here is one also interesting finding from that survey. Most important relevant thinkers. This was an open question. Okay, we did not give names of these scholars for Russian AI theories to identify. We simply asked who is the most important relevant thinker. And 35% of all those asked identified someone who might be familiar to you. Nikolai Danilevsky. Who was this guy anyway? Who is Nikolai Danilevsky?
He was first Russian geopolitician.
Right, right. You might say that he was the first Russian geopolitician, although you can have some geopolitical thinkers before, Feofan Prokopovich and even his predecessors. What is he known for, Nikolai Danilevsky?
For his work, Russia and Europe.
Exactly, yeah. That book, do you remember when that book was published, roughly? It is 19th century, you're right. It's 19th century, it's the late 60s, 1860s, the first edition. This was, the book was very critical of Germany. And this was a reflection also of a struggle for power in Europe, rising Germany as a potential problem for Russia, and pan-Germanic moods on the one hand, and increasingly critical Slavophile and pan-Slavic positions on the other. So Danilevsky was a pan-Slavist voice, someone who believed that's why the book is called Russia and Europe, someone who believed that Russia is not of Europe, that Russia is fundamentally, culturally different from Europe. It's its own cultural type. He produced the theory of socio-historical types. He identified 7 different types, and Russia was one of them. Europe, or Germanic type, was another one, and he argued that Russia and Europe potentially in cultural confrontation. So this is the first civilization theory, you might say. That's why it's significant. That's what people identified with already when we took this survey. And guess what? This is before the Crimea story. This is before Russia-Ukraine troubles. The idea that Russia is distinct culturally from the West, from Europe, predates the recent troubles that Russia has with the West. And guess who are the other most important scholars? Leontiev is another supporter of Russia as non-Western country. He was a famous diplomat in the Ottoman Empire. He was Vostochnik, so to speak. Someone whom Danilevsky actually viewed as his teacher. Danilevsky was very much influenced by Leontiev. Alexander Panarin is someone who contributed to these developments to Russian AI theory already after the end of the Soviet Union. So these are some of the key names that were identified in this survey, very interesting. Now let me show you a couple of more dates on Danilevsky. And this is also from research and not from that survey, from the article that I published last year. What does this one tell you? I can tell you how this data is produced. But this is about citations. This is about whom Russians cite. And more importantly, relative to whom and across which period of time. So you have here, if I were to have a laser pointer, I would point roughly to the 2009 as a very important point after which the interest in Danilevsky goes high, right? This is where it all begins, this work. In 2008, 2009. Again, this predates the Russia-Ukraine troubles. The idea that Danilevsky tells us something important about us, about our identity, then potentially Russian IR theory must respond to this need, is of 2008-2009. After this, it goes up. Before this, it's roughly similar to Fukuyama and Huntington, right? Both Fukuyama and Huntington, of course, are prominent, very prominent American thinkers. One liberal, and the other one is civilizational theorist, Samuel Huntington.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
And, what did happen in 2008?
A very good question. What is it that happened at the time? Hold on to this question. We'll come back to this in just a moment, because we'll try to understand. We'll try to explain it. But before we explain it, let me show you another graph. So this is Danilevsky, someone who is civilizational thinker relative to Western thinkers, right? This is when he becomes more prominent than Huntington. He becomes more prominent than Huntington after 2008. Right? This is roughly around 2012, if you judge it by this graph. Fukuyama is earlier than this. But if you compare Danilevsky to our thinkers, to Russian thinkers, then it's roughly the same time. Here, I only compare Danilevsky to Ilyin and Trubetskoy. You might ask why Ilyin and Trubetskoy? Well, Ilyin is very prominently cited also by Russian politicians. Putin cited him several times in his speeches. He certainly is well known. He is well cited. And even relative to Ilyin, Danilevsky is by far more popular. Right? Why Trubetskoy? And I only compared them based on the most important works. Ilyin work. Ilyin's work is Наши задачи, two-volume collection of articles, and that's the one that is cited the most. And Trubetskoy is Россия и человечество. It's also about showing the differences between Russia and Europe. And Trubetskoy, of course, is one of the founding fathers of classical Eurasian thought. So here is Danilevsky relative to Eurasians, still more prominent. Again, these are both supporters of Russian indigenous, national, some say nationalist development. This is not a comparison to Russian liberals. So that raises the question that you just posed. Why is it? How are we to explain it?
War in Georgia.
Possibly, but it probably is a cumulative development. It's a cumulative development of how Russia perceived the West, of how Russia at some period of time, and Georgia certainly contributed to this conflict with Georgia, but also Russia's growing problems with the West in foreign policy, Russia's very traumatic shock therapy experience in the 90s, NATO expansion, colored revolutions, all of this probably points in the same direction of Russia's growing disappointment with the West, and therefore looking for something else, looking for civilizational roots in this case. I don't have a good explanation for this because I don't have the qualitative research done. All I have is this quantitative story based on citations. It would be nice to be able to have interviews with relevant people, asking them the question that you asked. What is it that you find in Danilevsky? Why is he significant for you now and not in the early 2000s? But remember, the early 2000s is a very different story of Russia and the West, right? Russia reached out to the West by pledging all kinds of resources after September the 11th, after terrorist attacks. Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush became buddies, became friends. Putin traveled there. NATO expansion was not an issue at the time. And then it all began to change and go in a very different direction. And then there was a very important speech that Vladimir Putin gave called the Munich speech that really documented all the complaints that Russia had about the West. This is roughly when this change is taking place. But I have a somewhat more complex explanation of this. But in this case, I compare Danilevsky. This is all based on the article we published last year. So if you're interested, ask me, I'll send you the article. But here, it's a comparison to Eurasianism, the rise of Eurasianism, classical Eurasianism. And I stress specifically two reasons. One is Eurasianism rise in response to breakup of the Russian state, specifically after the revolution. Remember that Eurasianism is a phenomenon of Russian immigrant thought. Those who developed these ideas in immigration after the revolution. And it's also a response to growing Western pressures, specifically pressures on the new-born state, the Soviet state. Civil law, white armies. That's what I am going off here in explaining Danilevsky's rise as well. You have somewhat similar causes in effect. You have the Soviet breakup of the state. Granted, it's not a revolution, it was a peaceful breakup. But it was still a very big deal for Russians. It continues to be a very big deal, very traumatic. Initially, perhaps we didn't quite understand what happened, but it was a big deal. And increasingly, the more we are under pressure from the outside world, the more we are aware of the significance of that event. And then Western pressures, including what you mentioned, the war in Georgia, because the war in Georgia was also not just a war in Georgia, it was a war with the state that was essentially a client state of the United States, right? So it was about, at least to some extent, it was about NATO expansion, because immediately before that war, remember, Georgia and Ukraine were pushed by the United States to be granted MAP, which is Membership Action Plan, in Bucharest Summit in April 2008. That's significant. So, but again, I leave it open for you to interpret. So I'll skip some of these slides, moving forward to prospects. So where are we today? How should be? Well, actually, let me make one other point here. Danilevsky is important, but Danilevsky is not the only way to engage with Russia's cultural and civilizational distinctiveness. Earlier, I said to you that the idea that Russia is a system of values different from the West suggests two potential paths. One is nationalism, distinctiveness, isolationism from Europe, and that's Danilevsky. That's Russian Europe, that's cultural, historical type. That's something that eventually Gumilev developed in the idea of Russia being entirely different from the West as well. But the other one is the idea of you being different, distinct, and yet engaged in a dialogue with the other. The idea of cross-cultural dialogue, the idea of diversity. And just because we are different, in principle, doesn't mean we have to fight, right? That's what I tell to my American students. We're all different. In San Francisco State, when I teach, where I teach, students come from all over the world. I have about 30% Asians. I have some 20+% Hispanic. I have 10+% Europeans, including Russians. In my classes, some Africans. So the whole world is in the classroom. And whenever I introduce the idea of culture and civilization as an important idea that really does capture important differences among us, I ask, does it mean that we have to confront each other? Does it mean that we have to end up fighting each other? Or just because we're different, we can actually learn from each other rather than fighting. So that's a potentially different path included in our theory. And you'll be able to recognize the other not as a threat, but also as a source of learning. So Russia can, in principle, learn from Europe, and Europe can learn from Russia. Russia can learn from China, China can learn from Russia. without becoming this one global community with the center in the West. So that's a potentially different path as well. But Danilevsky is a symptom, if you will, is a symptom of important recognition of that we are culturally different, and somehow we have to be aware of this. So this is what I think is ahead of us. Russian IR theory is to develop, and I believe that it will. It will eventually do either one of these things or all of them together. Russia is not new to the world. It has multiple traditions, as I tried to show to you. It has very important thinkers. Yes, some say they're not exactly IR theories, but they have been thinking about the world for centuries, and therefore their contribution will be essential. You first must identify those thinkers, then and now. Today there are important and interesting thinkers as well. You must identify important debates. Knowledge is built around debates. We must see what these debates are in our cultural space, in Eurasian and European cultural space. What are the most important, most prominent debates? Some in academia, some in political space. And then potentially, hopefully, there will be more resources for empirical research. This is also something that I find quite lacking in Russian IR theory, in Russian IR scholarship, empirical research. And the more we have empirical research, the more we have basis for development, for generalization. And there will be further IR developments, theoretical developments, that I am quite sure of. Well, I promised I will leave some time for questions. Coming from him and from me. Please. Если я не очень вас запутал. Try to answer, try to ask these questions in English, but if you want to ask something you feel difficult to formulate in English, go ahead and ask in Russian, and I will respond in English. Please.
Could you please name some names in our modern Russian international relations theories? Which concepts are related now, maybe something like that?
Well, we can go back to these traditions and ideas. If you think about, for example, more pro-Western scholars, more pro-Western thinkers today, if you think about statist thinkers and civilizational thinkers, then you'll find multiple and interesting scholars. Are you asking my personal favorites, so to speak? I can give a very, very long list of scholars whom I personally read and continue to maintain contacts with. On Russian communism, for example, it's a very interesting version of a theory of Russian global political economy development has been developed by someone named Boris Kagarlitsky. Does it tell you anything? He has published multiple books. One of my favorites is called Периферийная империя, Peripheral Empire. It's published in 2003, but he has published several books since then. So this would be a left version of Russia's distinctiveness. Then, of course, judging simply by significance of names, aside from my preferences, intellectual preferences, there are many prominent Eurasianists. Alexander Dugin, whether or not you agree with him, is a very prominent Eurasianist thinker, someone who is well known in the West as well. Sometimes as Putin's advisor, unfortunately, but he's known also as a theorist. But you have very important developments within the Eurasian camp and beyond Dugin as well. There is a school of Slavophiles, or Neo-Slavophiles as well. Are you familiar with the name Boris Mezhuev, for example? Mikhail Remezov? There are a group of scholars who are arguing the position of so-called Russian non-ethnic nationalism. And they believe that Europe has been hijacked from Russia, Russia has been hijacked from Europe, but the future is ultimately in development of mutual enriching relationships between the two. Mikhail Ilyin is of this tradition as well. Someone who is no longer alive is Alexander Panarin, who is also a Slavophile thinker. Someone who is no longer alive was very interested in Eurasianist thinker Vadim Tsybursky, Ostrov России, and several other books that he published. And there are many in different camps as well. So potentially this is not a desert at all.
Are these our scientists are integrated in international systems? Academic international system.
That's the very, very, very good question, and that's the issue. That Russian IR theory in general is not very well integrated. Russian theoretical developments are yet to be integrated with global developments. It's happening, and I see more and more people coming to Western conferences, American conferences. I see more and more panels organized by Russian scholars. I see Russians teaching outside Russia, like myself, and developing something that potentially will contribute to this. But for now, this is one of the dimensions of the crisis that I mentioned. Something that will be improved, eventually solved, when we will have more empirical research, when we will have more appreciation of academic developments. That will become a more serious contribution. I would not be describing Russian IR today as a school. Some scholars do. It's not yet a school. It's only beginning to be a voice within international relations. There is a British school, as you know, or English school of international relations. But outside the West, schools are not yet established. Chinese made, I would say, more progress than the Russians, and even more progress than Indians, but even their school is not yet established. It's something that will continue to progress. Other questions, please?
Yes, first of all, I would like to say thank you to you for such a good presentation.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, and secondly, in your lecture you have mentioned that Ukraine is somehow a state of dividedness, I think, because it is the place where the Russian geopolitical interests and the American geopolitical interests are clashed.
It's interpreted radically differently by both sides.
I think all people in this class know why Russia is there, but why America is going there. Where is the main goal of them? And I think
for the United States.
Yes, from the allies in Europe.
I think there are multiple interpretations, multiple reasons, but I think fundamentally this is about world order. Fundamentally, this is about two radically different interpretations of what world order is and what world order will be. One would argue, and I would agree with this, that the United States has much fewer national interests in Ukraine than Russia, simply because it's far away, it has many other vital issues to address in Latin America. But nevertheless, the United States views itself, and it's about, again, elite self-perception, as a global power, as a superpower. Donald Trump, of course, is very different from Barack Obama, but you have some continuity here. Donald Trump couldn't care less about global institutions, WTO, even NATO expansion, but he cares about one thing for sure, and that's the United States power preponderance. He believes that the United States must be the superior power, to Russia, to China, everywhere in the world. And he has done something that Barack Obama didn't and would have not done. He provided already lethal weapons for Ukrainians. He's building bases in Ukraine as we speak. He is preparing greater security presence for the United States in Ukraine, short of membership in NATO. That's a very serious issue, and for him this is about power, this is about American role in global order, first and foremost. And for Russia, again, this is also a world order issue. If you're not sensitive to international law as it was established following the Yalta Conference, United Nations Conference, if you're not sensitive to a sphere of influence that we have as well, and our interests in Eurasia, then you're likely to have divided Ukraine rather than united Ukraine. It's not our preference, that's the position of the Kremlin. We had the preference, initial preference, as you remember, federalization. But if you're not respectful of this, then it will become a frozen conflict for quite some time, unfortunately for all sides involved. So Yalta world order, as it was conceived and understood by the Russians, was based on three elements. One is balance of power. Two is recognition of informal spheres of influence. And even during the Cold War, you remember that the West recognized informal spheres of influence. When the Soviets intervened in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, there was no response, right? And three, internal sovereignty. Internal sovereignty. All of these concepts of world order, as they were laid out in Yalta, were neglected by the United States. And Russia continues to subscribe to these ideas. It believes that it has its own very important interests in Eurasia, and Ukraine, I would argue, by far most important state for Russia in Eurasia, let alone Syria. Even Syria, to a great extent, is about Ukraine. It's about leverage in negotiations with Americans. So, and then of course sovereignty is important. For all these years, Russians were lectured by Americans that their system is not right, that they must have a different kind of democracy, that what they're doing in Chechnya is not appropriate and acceptable, and so forth. So that too is essential for Russia, to make a point. What Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine and in Syria, he is making a point, a very important point about world order. Thank you. Please.
I have somewhat of a controversial question. As you know, we're currently going through a process of articulating our civic values, of articulating the values that unite us as a nation. And this process is quite painful and, I might say, controversial. Is it possible to repurpose these three directions of Russian international relations theory and orient them towards the inner politics of Russia? I read in one of the works of Igor Gaidar about the statism as some kind of informal ideology that Russians share, but nobody speaks about it. Simply the idea of a state that unites and somehow denies the differences between different ethnic groups. Is it possible to repurpose these ideas?
For domestic development?
Yes, for domestic use.
Yeah, I think you're correct. And international relations and foreign policy is an important extension and reflection of domestic developments, right? So when you are developing certain foreign policy, it must have roots at home. Whenever you are building important alliances, they must also reflect some domestic balances, cultural balances, political balances. So the idea of statism, as you describe it, is also the idea of internal inter-ethnic peace. Yes. And it's very important that that concept is then projected abroad. That it's essential for Russia to not be guided by certain ethnic prejudices. That Russia stands by certain political constructs and constructs that are reflected in international law. But in the meantime, this has also been articulated internally. As you remember, Putin's articles before the 2012 elections reflected this already, right? There was the idea of intercultural balance there. He was, if I remember correctly, he first identified the Russian core there, русский стержень, русский народ as как стержень. But then he also said that this is absolutely essential for us to understand that Russia is a multi-ethnic community, and this was done for a reason. This was done as a way to address potential problems articulated by Russian nationalism. So that too is a statist concept, domestic statist concept, and it will then be reflected in foreign policy as well. The Western element of it is something that, again, not to go very far, Vladimir Putin himself identified. He said that we are part of Europe no matter where we live. In St. Petersburg or Vladivostok. He was referring specifically, this is an early Putin, he was referring specifically to Russia-European connection. He wanted to preserve Russia-European connection, but not at the expense of Russian sovereignty and great power status. This is a quintessential Putin. He is a liberal statist, as he first appears in the political scene. He changed several times, because he has been in power for many years. But he comes to power, as you remember, as a liberal statist, as a believer that Russia's future is with Europe. He identifies Peter the Great as his most important political figure to follow. And several developments in Russian foreign policy now can be viewed as a response of a person and a statesman who is deeply disappointed with Europe, deeply disappointed in his own initial attempts to build relationships with Europe in foreign relations. But in one respect, you're absolutely right that there is a very deep connection between domestic identity building and foreign policy. Please.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you for the presentation. I do have a question about considering the fact of the coexistence of such polar approaches or even like ideology, and we can see some kind of shifts and the situation of swinging in foreign policy and ideology as well.
Right.
I do have a question like somewhat on forecasting, like what we will see in future. Will we like always be in situation of this kind of swinging, or we will come to this like normal foreign policy, which will be some kind of union and performance of this kind of foreign policy?
That's a very good question, but that is impossible to predict. You know why? Simply because Russia, speaking of Russia's domestic traditions, Russia is diverse. The diversity will persist. And the unity, the consolidation is only possible when there is a prominent outside threat. When the Russians are threatened from the outside, they are united. They will live through all kinds of pressures and sanctions when there is this threat. But the world is moving in a very uncertain and unpredictable direction. How it will develop 10 years from now, it's very difficult to say. One thing is clear to me, that it will not be a return to Barack Obama's world. It will be an entirely different world, and in this case, Russia's future theoretical synthesis, because AR theory is about future as well, as I said, will have to speak to these traditions. We'll have to incorporate these traditions. It will be great reflection of Russia's cultural distinctiveness. It will still be the idea of power, and Russia's great power status, and it will still be the idea of Europeans. Think about contemporary Russian geopolitical concepts. Think about the idea of Russia as a big Eurasia, or the new big Eurasia articulated by Karaganov, of which Russia is a prominent part. Notice that in this Eurasia, Europe is a part of it. Right? That's a very big difference from Dugin. That's a very big difference from traditional Eurasianism associated with Trubetskoy, with Savitsky, with people who developed the notion of Russia as being non-Europe. Russia's Eurasia is non-Europe. In this case, Eurasia includes China and much of Asia, but it also includes Europe. So that too is incorporation of Western tradition as well. We are out of time. У нас время закончилось, я готов отвечать и дальше, но вам, наверное, нужен перерыв. Как вы скажете? Ну давайте тогда сколько нужно? 10 минут, 10-15 минут. Сейчас без 20 час. Давайте без 10, без 5 час. И мы еще same sociology of science approach to American IR. And now that we've had a discussion of Russian IR, it will give you also some frame of comparison, some contrasts. So the questions will be the same. What are the conditions of IR theory formation in the US? How it has emerged, developed over time? What are some of the schools? And of course, please bear with me, I cannot do justice to the entire American international relations theory. It's a very rich tradition with multiple schools of approaches. So I'll tell you what the argument will be. What are some of the problems, whether or not there is approaching crisis, and what are some of the prospects as well. So these are the same concepts. You're already familiar with this, based on Stanley Hoffman. In the United States, ideas, number one, of course, is the global mission. Global mission understood in terms of teaching the world the right values. Because in Russia, there is also the idea of a mission. But it's the idea of a mission that is limited to the historical geographic space that I described for you. And it's also the idea of global humanity, global understanding that has roots in Russian literature. I'm sure you are familiar with the concepts of all humanity, все человечество, and it's not just post-Eurasianist Slavophile thinkers, it's Dostoevsky. These are old ideas, but unlike American idea of global mission, Russian idea is the idea of cross-cultural, cross-civilizational understanding and dialogue, I would argue. But in this case, rationalism that has roots in European Enlightenment is very important. And I already described these values to you as values that are both universal and exceptional. It's very strongly rooted in American culture. You hear this in political statements, and not just American conservative nationalists, but people who are well-minded liberals, such as Barack Obama and others, stress the importance of exceptionalism in American values, even as they speak and deliver State of the Nation address. And then power, ambition, global power, institutional resources, all of it I'm just repeating myself to move forward to the emergence of American ideas. So that we have already covered. Shining City ultimately translates into democracy promotion, but it's also important to stress belief in science. I mentioned to you earlier that Americans, much more than Europeans, are believers in technology, believers in technological solutions, believers that science conquers it all. Sometimes I compare this, since I studied, as you did, history of my country, with the early beliefs of Bolsheviks. They will be able to transform the world based on scientific ideas. That they will become free by way of teaching the nature. I don't know how many have heard this expression. Природу научим, свободу получим. Okay, so we will teach nature, we will teach the world, and we will become free as a result of this. To some extent, this is what Americans' mentality is. It's a belief in science that is much firmer rooted in this tradition than in European tradition. And that's why there are some parallels with earlier Marxist thinking in Russia. That's why positivism is an essential part of American IR tradition. Not all American theories are positivist. But mainstream is positivist. Mainstream is committed not to Thomas Kuhn idea of paradigms that you and I have described earlier, but to the idea of Lakatosian program, Lakatosian analysis. And it's a new way of scientific knowledge. I won't go into details, but I can say a few words, if you like me, about positivism. Are you familiar with this notion of positivism? What is positive science? What is it in perhaps one sentence?
Social sciences should be structured and developed the way natural sciences are.
Yeah, that's a very good definition. You can extend also this further, but in principle, it has to be mastered by outside researchers. In positivism, there is subject and there is object, and they are firmly separated one from another. If you are scientists, then you are placed outside the object of your research, and you are to produce independent observations. Based on these independent observations, you formulate propositions, X leads to Y, and that's a theory, and then you apply it in different empirical settings. In social science context, if you are comparative politics experts, then you develop this from Asian experience, for example, if you're studying, for instance, Singapore economic development program, and you develop some ideas of how and why this is a product of certain culture, then you go to Latin America or to Africa and you study economic progress or lack thereof based on presence or absence of this kind of activist culture. That's a positivist proposition. That's a positivist way of doing science. You separate yourself from the object of your research. But if you are non-positivist, then you're trying to understand the object of your research from inside. You become a part of it. You develop special intimate relationships with people you study. You're becoming an anthropologist, so to speak, rather than social scientist. Well, there are some who prefer these methods in American IR theory, but the mainstream is predominantly positivist, which is why in Yale University, in Harvard, in most important American IR programs, you have 2 semesters of statistics. And you cannot do post-positivist research based on statistics. Statistics is about running variables. It's about testing X to Y. And that's ultimately what American mainstream IR theory, IR scholarship is in terms of science. It's about producing scientific knowledge universally applicable across the world. So this is another idea. And the third idea, very common and very important for American tradition, is the idea of pragmatism, the idea of practical application. All IR theory you develop must be politically significant, must be practically applicable. Otherwise, why bother? That's different from European tradition, particularly from European continental tradition, continental philosophy. Very different from Russian philosophical tradition. Certainly very different from Eastern tradition, tradition of concentration on producing ideas for the sake of ideas and enriching our understanding. In this case, it has to be practically significant and applicable to foreign policy. Perhaps that's why most important American philosophical tradition is called pragmatism. So these are ideas. The second level is elites' power, in power ambitions, and again, the idea of global dominance, hegemony, preponderance, however you wish to call it, is very essential. And it has roots in history. it has roots in very important historical developments. You can go back to Wilson specifically, because of course United States, for those of you who studied American history, you will recall, has a very powerful isolationist tradition as well. But the 20th century is the century when American intellectual tradition has changed. And Wilsonianism became the dominant foreign policy tradition. There were previously, actually they are present even today, 3 or 4 major traditions, intellectual traditions in the United States. Wilsonianism being just one. There was also Jacksonian tradition of military power, Hamiltonian tradition of trade, and Jeffersonian tradition of building democracy at home. But in the 20th century, Wilsonianism became the dominant, specifically after World War I, when the United States became involved in delivering peace in Europe, when Wilson formulated these points about international politics. And of course, in response to Nazi, the United States also developed a major change in identity. Wilsonianism became the name of American thinking about the world. The United States became global power by virtue of constructing international institutions for global trade, for financial architecture, and increasingly for providing security as well. And that's where we continue to be, and certainly after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union all of a sudden disappeared, the United States found itself in a vacuum of power that it quickly filled with these ideas. And it was going in a good direction, so to speak, all the way until 2016, when a major shock took place when Donald Trump was elected, and became an advocate of a different mentality, of a different idea. It's rooted less in Wilson and more in Andrew Jackson idea of what America is, American nationalism is. Andrew Jackson was a general who was a believer in military power and power preponderance. And I don't know if it's true or not, but the rumor has it when Donald Trump was elected, he ordered to replace a bust of Thomas Jefferson with a bust of Andrew Jackson in the White House. He's not an intellectual by any means, but someone tipped this idea for him, possibly Stephen Bannon, someone who is intellectual. So that's where ideas are today. It is somewhat paradoxical, you might say. On the one hand, Americans believe in science, right? They believe that there is a need for objective knowledge, and we must strive for creating this objective knowledge. On the other hand, they pursue partisan political agenda. They want to continue to order the world, so to speak, to shape, frame, and define the world. And there must be a contradiction here, right? If you are pursuing ideas based on science, it's one story. But if you're simply committed to your own interests, then there might be a conflict with science. So it's a somewhat paradoxical development, but again, it's solved, and it's solved through the idea of exceptions. It's solved through the idea that our science is the universal science. Here is how Stanley Hoffman made sense of it himself. So, American intellectuals do not like certainly this idea that somehow they are not objective. They don't like the idea that they are politically committed, so to speak. But then this link certainly exists, and this is what Hoffman identifies in his research. And then the next level, he says, is important, is the level of institutions, and it's reinforced by institutional arrangements. What does he mean by it? Well, he means specifically that IR scholarship in the United States doesn't exist in political vacuum. It's developed in response to political needs. It's very much supported by state funds. On the one hand, there is formal independence. Most American IR programs certainly are not somehow dependent on this funding by the state. There are very important private institutions. But then we also know that prominent policymakers, American policymakers, oftentimes teach in those institutions after they finish their career. Think about Harvard, for example, a major, most important, some say the most important private university in the United States. But this is also the university where oftentimes State Department officials end up teaching. And so the ideas that they promote there are the ideas that are closely linked to foreign policy community. Perhaps it's not surprising that Samuel Huntington formulated many of his ideas while teaching at Harvard, and Samuel Huntington received much of his funding from Defense Department, from state institutions. So that link is important as well. And that link also reinforces American commitment, theoretical commitment to policy ideas of US-centered world, as I described to you. So these are just some examples for you of how this linkage between policy world and independent, quote-unquote, IR community is reinforced. It's reinforced when State Department officials teach at these universities. It's reinforced when state funds are used for IR development. There is a very good book I'll mention to you by Israeli sociologist Ida Oren, who teaches in the United States. It's called Our Enemy and Us. And us, of course, is read both us and the United States. It's a research about how most important American concepts of political and economic development were produced in close connection with national security establishment. He argues specifically that the research on political culture, which was developed in the 50s and 60s by American scholars in order to understand the outside world, in order to understand Africa and Asia, how that research was funded by Defense Department, how that research was funded by state institutions, because it helped ultimately to generate these practical implications about development in compliance with American expectations of the world development. And I already mentioned to you how Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation produced textbooks and distributed IR textbooks, American IR textbooks, free of charge, globally, except the Soviet Union, of course, in the countries of the socialist orientation. But in Asia, in Africa, these textbooks were freely distributed as a way of promoting American ideas. All right, so where are we now? The argument that I will make here for you is that collapse of the bipolar system, a system that is also known as a Cold War, changed the international relations scholarship in the United States. When the United States discovered that it is now in a position to dominate the world, even more so than it did during the Cold War, because the Soviet Union is no more, the mainstream scholarship also became more sensitive to global American hegemony needs. And what I will argue to show it to you, and that will be also my way of showing American schools of international relations, mainstream schools, is that all three main schools, realism, liberalism, and constructivism, became far more sensitive to the need of American domination, became more active in promoting the ideas of US-centered world. Each in their own way, they became more American and more unipolarity sensitive than before. Realism, of course, is complex. You have multiple schools there. You have classical realism, the oldest tradition, and there are classical realists today in America. perhaps best known name for you is Henry Kissinger, but there are other classical realists in the policy community and outside. But the most important school today in American realism is called structural realism, or neo-realism, the one that stresses the primacy of the international system. Neoclassical realism is an attempt to introduce more complexity, to understand also foreign policy in terms of some domestic forces, but even neoclassical realism is not deviating from the idea all major developments of world politics is a response to the international structure, the structure of the international system. And that's the insight that goes back to the structural realism, was articulated first and foremost by someone whose name might be familiar to you, Kenneth Waltz, someone who taught at UC Berkeley, someone who published two very important books. One was called State and War. Am I not remembering correctly? It's about 3 levels of analysis: man, state, and war. It's called. It was published in 1959. And second, very important book was called The Structure of International Politics, 1979. And very much American realism remains in the shadow of Kenneth Waltz. Although there are other prominent theorists, people such as John Mearsheimer and the whole school of Columbia realism, Kenneth Waltz continues to be a very important figure because he's the one who created structure of realism. So what realism became after the end of the Cold War, it became in some respects explanation of and justification of, to the extent that justification is present in AR theory, of American unipolarity, of American unipolar dominance. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. Then there is liberalism, and here is my argument, that liberalism changed as well from promoting international institutions, early work associated with the notion of interdependence, global interdependence, introduced by scholars such as Joseph Nye and Robert Cohen, is no longer popular. The contemporary realism became very much about democracy promotion. It became very much about soft power. It's about promoting American ideas rather than about building international institutions. So even here, you have change, fundamental change in the direction of justifying American-centered world order on the level of AR theory. And last but not least, constructivism, which is a relatively new phenomenon. It only was introduced in the 1980s. It was introduced as an attempt to study different cultures, because it's about cultural sensitivity. It's about trying to understand not just interests, but identity and values. It became very much about promoting global norms as they are rooted in the West. The notion that constructivists developed in this case, most important scholar here, there are several, but one that I will name for you is Martin Finnemore, is the notion of cultural isomorphism. So the whole world is becoming culturally homogeneous, increasingly increasingly united, based on Western ideas and Western ideals as taught by Western international organizations, such as IMF, World Bank, World Health Organization, organization about banning chemical weapons, and so forth and so on. So that's, in some ways, I'm simplifying in some respects, but this is an important development that you want to keep in mind if you want to connect IR theory development to these 3 levels of analysis as introduced by Stanley Hoffman. Again, there is diversity within each of these schools. I already mentioned some of these points to you with respect to realism. Kenneth Waltz was a scholar of containment. He stressed the importance of the international system, unlike Hans Morgenthau, who was a classical realist. Kenneth Waltz is more defensively oriented. He believes that stability comes from preserving status quo. And Mearsheimer is the opposite. He believes that most policymakers in the world will fight and struggle for change. They will not be interested in status quo. They will be interested in getting more power rather than preserving security and stability. But right now, the game is in the primacy school. American realism now is very much about preserving primacy. There are two scholars here that I want to mention to you. One is Bill Wolfer, who formulated the idea of stability of unipolarity. He published a very important article, actually in a policy journal, in 1999 first, and then it became also a thesis that he developed in the mainstream IR journals. But that article was published in Foreign Affairs, and it was called The Stability of Unipolar World. So it's essential for the world, if it wants to be peaceful and stable, to have American unipolarity. That's the argument. And that's what American realism became after the end of the Cold War. You would have not had this argument under Kenneth Waltz and during the Cold War. It's new. Right now, actually, many American realists are disappointed. They are not happy with the way the United States preserved the world. So you have many voices of dissent within realism, and you have some who are no longer committed to the idea that the world is stable as a result of American hegemony. But you also have some who say that it still is relatively durable, which is not stability of Bill Wolfer's name. It's not peaceful. You can have wars locally in Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, but it still is not a global war. It's not the large, great power war that we experienced during World War I and World War II. And at least for that, the world should be grateful to the United States. That's the argument advanced by Nuno Monteiro, who is actually a student of John Mearsheimer. And Mearsheimer is a skeptic. He's not a believer in American unipolarity, but Bill Wolfer is. So you have some voices of dissent, those whom I call recessive views. You remember Samuel Huntington's argument. Samuel Huntington, of course, was not a fan of American unipolarity. John Mearsheimer is a believer that great powers want more power, but he himself does not advocate it. He describes these instincts of states to have more power as a tragedy. His book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And he recently published this year, just last month actually, published a very important book, which is a critique of liberal world order. It's called The Grand Delusion, this book. He has a good friend and co-author. They published several important works together. One book that I will mention to you is called The Israeli Lobby, a critique of the predominance of Jewish lobby within the American foreign policy community. He published it jointly with a scholar who is a student of Kenneth Waltz. His name is Stephen Walt. And Walt, incidentally, published a very similar book just this month called The Hell of Good Intentions. It's also a critique of liberalism. And it's also a critique of the argument that somehow the world will be better off if Americans are running it. Okay, that's realism. Let me say a few words about liberalism and how liberalism changed as well. As I mentioned to you, liberals believed in institutions. They believed in economic interdependence. They described the international system in terms of cobweb. Everyone is dependent on everyone. It was less about power and more about mutual economic and political transactions and relationships. Well, guess what? That changed too. It's about values and soft power much more than it used to be. Cohen and Knight, who introduced the idea of global interdependence, Cohen retired. He is no longer active IR scholar, but Joseph Nye is publishing books about United States soft power. It's about way to maintain dominance through soft power. He is the one who invented this concept that I'm sure you have heard before, right? Soft power is well known in Russia. The other argument that was well known in the 70s, in the 80s, was introduced by Cornell scholar Peter Katzenstein. And it was about national institutions. It was about how global economic changes still do not make countries similar in how they develop and progress because of domestic institutions, different national political systems. That argument is no longer there as well. It became, as I said, about soft power, democratic peace, and the triumphant mood was set by Francis Fukuyama's now well-known article, The End of History. The end of history itself was meant to be the end of non-liberal trends, right? The world became liberal. All alternatives defeated: communism, Islamism, fascism. All of it is no longer relevant. We are now marching forward. That's liberalism in a nutshell, although again I am simplifying for the purpose of presenting the argument. Let me say a few words about constructivism as well. It's about, again, identity, culture, and norms. And in the 70s and the 80s, it was first and foremost about criticizing realism. Constructivists were interested in criticizing the idea that somehow everything in the world depends on the international system. Very important scholars, mostly not in the mainstream, were Richard Ashley, Hayward Alker, Robert Walker, at least some of the names for you, were mostly critical of anarchy. We were arguing that anarchy itself is a concept. It's not out there. It's a concept that is introduced for the for better promoting American foreign policy ideas. They were outside the mainstream, but within the mainstream, within the more dominant American universities, Harvard, Berkeley, Cornell, and others, there were also scholars increasingly challenging the ideas of anarchy and stressing the importance of social context. I've listed some names for you. John Ruggie, who was a major political economist, who was arguing that political economy is very much about culture. It's not just about those market values. Nick Onuf, who introduced the idea of social world in international politics. Alexander Wendt. Is any of these names familiar with you? How many of you have heard the name of Alexander Wendt? He is the one who introduced the idea that anarchy is what states make of it. It was a famous article that he published in the major journal of international relations called International Organization, in which he said that the idea of anarchy is something that states created for understanding each other. It's a language, first and foremost. And then he recently published a book, actually not so recently, it's already 15 years old, the book on cultures of anarchy. So anarchy, again, for him is not something out there to be discovered, but it's a culture that produces then different types of relationships between states. Sometimes enemy culture, sometimes rivalry or competition, and sometimes partnership. But these are the old developments. Since the 90s, American constructivism became more about promoting global norms as rooted in the West. I mentioned to you Martha Finnemore, the school that has roots in Stanford sociology, John Mayer and others. There is also an argument about spreading norms, Catherine Sinkins and others. mostly human rights norms. So again, these are Western norms and how they are promoted across the world. This is a Minnesota school, University of Minnesota. And then there is also a very prominent, still prominent argument that Peter Katzenstein developed, the one who was arguing about national institutions, published a book he edited, mostly a collection of his students' work, called The Culture of National Security. And quite a few of chapters in that book is also arguing that states are increasingly responding to global norms, such as non-use of weapons, for example. They ask the question, why states do not use nuclear weapons? One realist would say, well, because they are afraid of being annihilated, right? They've been afraid of being destroyed. Constructivists are saying, well, that's part of it. But the other side of it, that there is already a norm out there, that even if you try, you will be then firmly isolated by the rest of the international community. If you don't like the argument about nuclear weapons, then how about chemical weapons? Fewer and fewer states are using chemical weapons because there is a chemical weapons taboo. And that's a norm, it's a cultural norm rooted in the West by non-Western states. That's the argument. All right, let me say a few words. We still have about 30 minutes and I will leave time for questions as well. But let me say a few words about non-mainstream. Okay, mainstream is presented or represented by realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Non-mainstream is not positivist. Methodology of non-mainstream is different. It's about trying to study the world differently, more as an involved observer, more through interviews, analyzing and studying discourse, understanding speeches, rather than running statistical analysis or connecting variables either through individual cases or through multi-cases based approaches. And outside methodology, the substantive agenda of this research is very different, of course. What unites feminists, critical geopolitics, and political economists and others? Not very much, but they are all critical of the United States hegemony. That's in part why they are also non-mainstream scholars. And they are mostly based in different universities. You will not find very prominent non-mainstream scholars at Harvard or Cornell or Princeton. They will be placed elsewhere. So here, the argument that they make is that it's important not only to explain what happens, but to understand the other side. And it's important to ask questions: who benefits as a result of these theories? And beyond this, if you are leftist political theories, quasi-Marxist or Marxist, it's important to create conditions to emancipate the world, to change the structure in such a way that people who are affected by all these global developments will become actors, will become practical participants as well. But these are some of the similarities, and they're all different in many respects. They are critical of modernity in US foreign policy, but then there are differences as well. Let me say a few words about these differences. I have not identified, of course, all the different schools, but for the sake of our discussion, for the sake of this brief overview, I will say a few words about three different approaches. One is called critical political economy, that studies the so-called dark side of globalization. There are very important works here associated with Ruggie, Cox, Birch, and Property. And they are simply trying to understand who is on the suffering end of globalization. Because the mainstream tells you that globalization is good, right? Others being equal, the world is better off. We have open trade, we have growing economic output, we do not have major war, we have stability, and that's all fine. But what about those who are on the suffering end of globalization? What about minorities? What about women, oftentimes who are affected much more disproportionately by these global disruptions than men? What about low social classes? Who will speak on their behalf? It's about their voices in world politics as well. It's about their identity as much as it is about the identity of these prosperous states. That's the argument that critical political economy makes. And critical geopolitics does the same on a geographic and political level. They are trying to understand hegemony through culture. They are arguing that hegemony and boundaries change is a reflection of our cultural stereotypes. There is quite a bit of research by John Agnew, by Ida Warren, I already mentioned to you, specifically on how boundaries change, reflect preferences of hegemonic states in the region or global. For instance, there is research about Kosovo's recognition of Kosovo's independence, and how that recognition benefits some states rather than others, and how that potentially undermines Europe's unity, and how that serves preferences of large states in Europe and outside, but not necessarily those inside, in the Balkans, certainly not Serbia, certainly not Russia. So that too is an agenda for studying political change across the world, with these questions in mind: who is to benefit, whose identity does it advance? And I already mentioned to you feminism. The idea of separating public and private, feminists argue, is the idea that has roots in modernity, but it's the idea that benefits men disproportionately more than women. And who is to study the world from the position of women, particularly from the position of those women who are suffering as a result of interstate conflicts, as a result of promotion of so-called transnational corporations. That's why modernity is viewed as gendered, patriarchal, and not universal. Notice the challenge to both US hegemony and to US method of objective universal social science. It's not universal. It's good for you, but it's not good for me. And who is to explain the world from my world, from my perspective, from my identity? And that applies to the idea of human rights as well. There are divides and debates within even these theories. For instance, there is a debate within feminism between so-called Western feminists and non-Western feminists. Non-Western feminists, specifically African feminists, will say that, look, your stress on women's political rights is perhaps important, but for us, it's much more important that there is greater economic equality, that we are able to put some food on the table, that we are able to feed our families, that somehow we are able to defend ourselves from violence in the family, rather than about women's rights to vote. That's your agenda, not our agenda. So that debate is there as well. A few words about problems in approaching crisis. Well, I think the realism already is experiencing some problems. The argument that the world is no longer stable, but only robust, but US unipolarity is still essential, is somewhat recessive, is a step back from the earlier argument. Liberalism and constructivism are also somewhat stagnating and declining, because soft power argument is no longer as popular as it was even 5 years ago. And I'll have some evidence, if you like me, I'll present. Why is this the case? Well, perhaps it has to do with changes in the world. It has to do with yet another major change, similar to the end of the Cold War. And that change has to do with power position of the United States in the system, relative to other powers, relative to China. The United States is no longer as committed to liberal world order. Witness Trump and his ideas about the world, right? But the problem is that I think criticizing, as Mearsheimer and Walt do, criticizing liberalism is no longer enough. You need to understand also why the United States, even though it's no longer liberal, as expressed by Donald Trump, still is committed to the idea of power supremacy, and what kind of scholarship, IR theory, this will generate. That's an interesting question. Is it a crisis? I don't know. I'm putting this for our discussion. In some respects it is, because IR crisis, international relations crisis, is a crisis of identity. If you have a national identity crisis, then you will have also search for new ideas. And the United States now is changing. Its identity is changing. From Wilsonianism, as I said to you earlier, to Jacksonianism or something else, we don't know. Russia is, has suffered from this post-Cold War, post-Soviet identity crisis, and that crisis is somewhat over. Now, of course, we are witnessing new change. The question is what these world order changes will bring to the Russian IR. That's a somewhat new development. But the United States is not even adjusted to post-empire. Russia is no longer interested in becoming Soviet empire or neo-Soviet empire. It wants to have special relationships with some states. It wants to have influence in Eurasia, but it doesn't want to be an empire. An empire is expensive. We did it before. We did not like it. It's a different idea, different adjustment. But Americans now are sort of moving away from the commitment to prosperity and democracy to something else, but they're not yet ready to give up an empire. Maybe they are. In this case, Trump is not an imperialist, but he is really a superpower nationalist. But it creates a room for new approaches in U.S. foreign policy and in U.S. IR theory as well. What will this be? It's hard to tell, but I'll present to you very briefly results of another survey, not taken by me, but it's published. An American survey of international relations scholarship has been done twice in the year 2005 and 2011. I mean, the time span is not large enough, only 6 years, but it still gives you some ideas about what changes in American international relations scholarships. These names are somewhat familiar to you because I mentioned them just now. I'll just say that Robert Cohen was a major voice of liberalism in American IR. Kenneth Waltz is, of course, the founding father of structural realism. John Mearsheimer today is the most popular realist in the United States, teaches at the University of Chicago. Alexander Wendt is one of the most important mainstream constructivists. Joseph Nye is a liberal, teaches at Harvard, with policy experience as well. Michael Doyle is in many ways the founding father of democracies don't fight each other concept. Teaches at Princeton. Bruce Russett is at Yale, someone who tested the ideas of democracies don't fight each other, produced dozens and dozens of students with dissertations about democracies across the world. And Huntington, of course, is the author of the Clash of Civilizations thesis, also taught at Harvard, passed away several years ago. But see how their perception of whether or not they are important changed. What will be your observations? And I'll summarize mine in just a moment for you. And that will tell us something not abstract, but specific about directions, possible directions in which American IR is moving. Well, first, based on this, you are observing the decline of liberalism. decline and ambivalence of liberalism. Look where Cohen is. He lost 17 points as a result of theoretical developments. Right? Look where Russet is. Russet lost 4 points. He didn't have that many in the first place, only 11 points. That means 11% of those people who were asked in the American international relations community about the prominence of the scholars identified Russet as a prominent, influential scholar over the last 20 years. So 11% did so in 2005, and 7% did so in 2011. So Russell lost 4 points, and Doyle lost all points. He was not identified as an influential voice in 2011. So liberalism is on decline. That's observation number one. Although you might say the soft power is still there, right? Joseph Nye gained 3 points over these 6 years. So that concept is still in. Although, as I said, this was taken in 2011. We already have 7 years not addressed by this survey. That's the first observation. Second is also not favorable to realism. John Mearsheimer gained 1 point. He was identified as a very influential scholar in 2005 by 18% of the population, and only by 19 in 2011. Kenneth Waltz lost 15 points. Kenneth Waltz, again, is the founding father of structural realism. He lost 15 points. And Huntington lost, if Huntington is a realist, that's a good question. He lost 11 points as well. So realism is on decline as well. And that perhaps is a sign of a crisis, approaching crisis. Who gained in this case the most is Alexander Wendt. Right? So there is a potential for constructivism in American IR. In which direction constructivism will develop, I don't know. And again, it's very hard, awfully hard to generalize about American IR developments, about Russian theoretical developments. So this is only one way of doing so. I must be very clear that this is no claim to have definitive judgment. This is only a way for us to have some sense of where American IR is moving. So these are some of the observations for you to conclude. 4 observations I based on these 2 surveys. I wish there would be more surveys of this nature, but there are only 2 available. And as I was getting ready for our lectures today, I came across those and thought that I would use it to give you something specific, something concrete. So that's the conclusion. What are the prospects? Certainly there will be new theories. Hegemonic consensus is now challenged. American hegemonic consensus is challenged, and that means we will see more IR theoretical developments responding to this change in American position. Ideas-wise, if you go back to Stanley Hoffman, ideas now are likely to change as well. We are already in the midst of American identity crisis. American politics, domestic politics, is a mess. Is a competition between liberalism on the one hand and nationalism on the other, and it's something that will be ultimately reflected in foreign policy and IR theory developments as well. And power changes as well. United States, don't get me wrong, will remain preponderant power, will remain superpower in the world for many years, possibly decades forward. But it will still not be the same position that it held over these last 15 years after the end of the Cold War. And it will be reflected in American scholarship on international relations. What will happen, I don't know, but certainly we will have less over inter-paradigm debates. We'll have somewhat more non-hegemonic approaches in IR theory development. We'll probably have more versions of superpower nationalism in American IR theory. I don't know. as we would like to say in Russia, the weather for tomorrow will be announced the way after tomorrow. I'll stop here, and there is 10 minutes for questions as well. Please feel free to ask me questions either in English or in Russian. And again, as I said, I hope I have not confused you. Please.
Можно на русском спрошу?
Пожалуйста. Пожалуйста. Можно я буду по-английски отвечать? Просто потому, что так было заведено организаторами.
Да, я постараюсь на английском, я буду очень витиевато, очень очень.
Пожалуйста.
Так вот, вопрос в следующем. Буквально минуту назад вы сказали, что сложно дать какие-то конкретные прогнозы по этим пунктам. А что будет влиять на вот эти изменения и какие ключевые факторы в формировании их, скажем?
As I said, I am using Stanley Hoffman's model, and I used it for explaining how American IR developed. It has to do with ideas, it has to do with ambitions of political elites, and it has to do with institutional arrangements, specifically how close you are to power and how much money you have to develop international relations. And so what will happen with American IR will also be shaped by these levels. As I said, on ideas level, American old ideas, the predominance of Wilsonianism is already challenged. And that means we are not likely to see development of the old liberal theories that the United States must do everything in its power to preserve global openness, economic openness, or promote democracy. That research is likely to be on decline. That's one possible prediction based on ideas. Power level is still there. Most American mainstream political class and mainstream theorists, intellectuals in the United States continue to believe that the United States is destined to be number one in the world. Without the United States predominance, hegemony, the world will become a mess even more than it is today. So here we are likely to see some new versions of American nationalist, superpower nationalist IR developing. It will be less liberal, but still US-centered world. That will be second possible prediction. And as far as institutions, it will not change fundamentally because the United States continues to have sufficient funds for developing IR research. It still is second to none in the world. Most scholars across the world continue to be interested in building relationships with American IR, travel to American conferences. And the level, the linkage of American scholars and policy community, also something that was stressed by Stanley Hoffman, is likely to stay as well. Whether you teach at Harvard or at Princeton, there will be people who will be with major policy experience, and they will be teaching from their policy experience, and they will be there for educating students in the spirit of preserving American ideals. Okay. Thank you. Please.
Thank you for your report. My question is, so I have recently read the book of Henry Kissinger, Diplomacy.
Okay.
And there he compared two American presidents, Roosevelt and Wilson. He compared
which Roosevelt?
Theodore.
Okay.
He compared their manner of behavior in international relations. So Roosevelt, he loved more balance of power,
right.
And Wilson was more connected with values and their spread in the world. Could we tell which to whom of these two presidents is Trump closer?
That's a good question.
Or his he's in the middle, or
Right. No, I think he's unquestionably closer to Teddy Roosevelt. Yes, he's also a believer in negotiating from strengths. And Teddy Roosevelt, remember, his famous expression was speak softly but carry a big stick. Well, Trump doesn't speak softly, he speaks very loudly, but he certainly carries a big stick as well. He is a believer in threats and sanctions. He wants to negotiate from that position. He wants to do deals based on great power ideas. He's also a believer in rearranging the world based on power principles. Look how he conducts foreign policy. He begins with threats, always does, very high level threats, and then he moves down a little bit and concludes a deal. Sometimes that deal is not what was expected, because, for instance, he negotiated a deal with Mexicans on NAFTA, and NAFTA is not very much different from the previous NAFTA. But initially, as you remember, he said that Mexicans must build a wall, they must pay for this. So he had lots of promises to the Americans that he could not deliver. Now look at his relationships with Saudis, with Saudi Arabia. After all these problems with Saudi journalists killed in Turkey currently now ordered by Saudi prince, there is enormous outrage in the liberal part of the world, in the West, to put pressures on Saudi Arabia to introduce sanctions. And Donald Trump just issued a statement, I think it was yesterday, that it's important for us to have relationships with Saudis, otherwise the weapons that they're purchasing from Russia, they will continue to purchase from Russia. And what about our weapons? We must have political deals made in this case. It's not Woodrow Wilson, it's Teddy Roosevelt speaking through Donald Trump. And Woodrow Wilson did not like balance of power in the first place, right? You mentioned Woodrow Wilson. I'm sure Kissinger describes his philosophy that balance of power is bad for peace, right? Wilson hated hidden diplomatic arrangements. He did not believe in secret negotiations. He did not believe in balance of power. He was all for openness and transparency as the future for the world order. This is somewhat closer, although Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are not exactly Wilsonians either, but it's certainly closer to their ideas than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is also known, as you remember, for coercing Russia to vet negotiations after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So he is someone that I think Trump may have in mind, although Trump likes Andrew Jackson more. But I think it's a good analogy that you're making. If I am to choose, then I would point or see Trump without hesitation as following Teddy Roosevelt's step rather than Woodrow Wilson. Any other questions? English or Russian? Пожалуйста.
So, thank you again. My question is, you will know the famous book of Fire and Fury inside the White House of Donald Trump. There, the American journalist is describing the kitchen of the White House and the administration of Donald Trump. And my question is there a real conflict between Trump and the journalist, between him and CNN and Fox News? Because recently he gave a press conference, if I don't mind, where he said, you're fake news, just a game, something like that, if I don't mind. Or he just like talking.
Well, this is very far away from my theory, and I have not read the book. I've heard of it, but it certainly is clear that Donald Trump is not a fan of CNN. And there is now a lawsuit against Donald Trump, as you may know. I think it's Woodrow, right? Who wrote the book. He identified some very unknown and interesting and important developments about Donald Trump in that book. There is certainly a conflict, if you ask me, between Donald Trump on the one hand and the liberal establishment in part represented by CNN on the other. It's not even a conflict, it's a major war. Fox News and Donald Trump is very far away from CNN. And they believe, CNN and that community believe that Donald Trump would have not won without Russia. That continues to undermine Donald Trump. We will see what Robert Mueller's investigation will bring, but so far we have not had the concrete evidence that if Russia did interfere in the US elections, it made a major difference in terms of Trump's being elected. Ну ладно, спасибо вам. Вопрос еще, пожалуйста, последний, пожалуйста.
Just a quick question. In the previous lecture, you made a point about the lack of the intellectual basis for the Russian international relations,
right,
about Russian international policy. But at the same time, we have like the Moscow University of International Relations, which is always regarded to the highest team, and we have Sergei Lavrov, who is also regarded to be a very professional man. Isn't there a contradiction between the professionalism of Sergei Lavrov and his team on the one hand, and the lack of intellectual groundwork for the whole vector of the Russian international policy?
Briefly, there is in that gap, so to speak, is breached by professionalism, is breached by enormous experience of people like Sergei Lavrov, who is first well schooled in international relations, who is a thinker himself, who even produces occasional articles, as busy as he is. Even though there is no major theoretical developments in this respect, it is through pragmatism and through statesmanship that Russian foreign policy holds the course, so to speak. This is not new, by the way. Russian foreign policy has been a product of pragmatism and pragmatic improvisations for centuries. This is something that sometimes has been successful, sometimes not so successful. There were multiple mistakes in Russian foreign policy as well, but there were also very important accomplishments. But to answer your question, there is a gap, and that gap is bridged by experience and professionalism.